Rain fell in thin, cold sheets over the underground parking structure, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects above rows of empty concrete pillars. Evelyn Carter staggered between two parked cars, one hand pressed hard against her shoulder, blood seeping through her fingers and dripping onto the wet floor. Her bodyguard was gone. Her phone lay crushed somewhere behind her, its screen shattered under a stranger's boot. Somewhere in the shadows, she could still hear footsteps, patient and unhurried, the footsteps of men who knew she had nowhere left to run. Then she saw him, a man in a gray maintenance uniform standing on a short ladder, calmly replacing a flickering bulb, as if the world outside his small circle of light did not exist. She opened her mouth, and only two words came out, barely a whisper, swallowed almost instantly by the rain. "Help me." In that single moment, something behind Marcus Johnson's calm brown eyes shifted, quiet and total, like a switch thrown deep inside a machine that had been sleeping for years. His breathing slowed instead of quickening, a strange and terrible calm settling over his shoulders as his body remembered a discipline no ordinary maintenance man should have ever needed to learn. The tool belt around his waist no longer looked like something a janitor wore. It looked like something a soldier had converted, out of habit, into a weapon rack. Nobody in that parking garage knew that the quiet man changing light bulbs had once been trained to keep his pulse under 60 beats a minute, while bullets passed inches from his skull. Nobody knew that the scars crossing his forearms were not from accidents with machinery, but from a life he had buried so deep that even his own reflection sometimes forgot it. For 3 years he had shown up to this building every night at 10 o'clock, fixed what was broken, spoken to almost no one, and disappeared before sunrise, like a ghost who preferred not to be noticed. Tonight, for the first time since he had walked away from that other life, instinct took the wheel completely, and the ladder beneath his feet became something closer to a launch point than a tool. Marcus stepped down without a sound, set the bulb gently on the hood of a nearby car, and turned toward the woman bleeding just 20 feet away, his eyes already sweeping the garage, the way a soldier reads a battlefield, rather than the way a bystander reads a crisis. He was cataloging exits, counting support pillars, measuring the distance between shadows, doing all of it in the space of 2 or 3 heartbeats, while his face remained almost eerily unreadable. Evelyn Carter, CEO of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country, a woman worth more money than entire small nations, had just uttered the most honest sentence of her adult life to a stranger in a uniform, and neither of them yet understood how deeply their two separate worlds were about to collide. By day, Marcus Johnson was the kind of man people looked past without ever truly seeing. A background figure in coveralls who fixed leaking pipes, replaced broken locks, and kept the elevators of a 40-story commercial tower running smoothly for the thousands of office workers who rode them daily. His co-workers on the maintenance crew, men like Danny Wexler and Ray Alvarez, considered him friendly enough but distant, the kind of colleague who said good morning, did excellent work, and never lingered long enough at lunch to talk about much beyond the weather. None of them had ever asked why he always chose the seat facing the door in the break room, or why his eyes flicked toward every entrance and exit whenever he stepped into a new space, as automatic as breathing. None of them knew that the faded burn scar along his left forearm had come from a helicopter extraction gone wrong, in a country most Americans could not find on a map, or that the small circular scar near his collarbone had come from a bullet that missed his heart by less than an inch. Marcus lived alone in a modest apartment across town, a place with almost no decoration beyond a single framed photograph of a boy he rarely spoke about, the son from a marriage that had quietly ended years earlier, under the accumulated weight of secrets he was never permitted to share. He kept his life simple on purpose, ate the same few meals, drove the same worn pickup truck, and avoided anything that might draw attention his way, because attention, in his old line of work, was the surest way to end up dead, or to get someone else killed. Even now, years removed from the version of himself that once operated in the shadows of conflicts the public never learned the names of, certain habits refused to fade. He still counted the seconds it would take to reach the nearest stairwell from any room he entered, and he still slept lightly enough to wake at the smallest change in the sound of his apartment. He had told himself, over and over, that this quiet, unremarkable life was the reward he had earned, a chance to disappear completely and simply exist without consequence. Across the city that same rainy evening, in a glass boardroom 40 stories above street level, Evelyn Carter sat at the head of a long table, facing a circle of investors and board members who watched her with expressions ranging from admiration to open hostility. She was 37 years old, sharp-featured and sharper-minded, the woman who had built Carter Dynamics from a struggling startup into a technology empire, worth billions of dollars through sheer stubbornness and an unwillingness to let anyone underestimate her twice. On the table in front of her sat the final documents for an acquisition deal that would either cement her company's dominance for the next decade or, according to several nervous voices in that room, hand too much control to outside interests disguised as friendly partners. Not every board member wanted the deal to close, and the sharpest disagreement came from a man named Richard Voss, a silver-haired senior board member whose objections seemed, to anyone paying close attention, oddly specific and oddly well-informed for someone supposedly opposed to the merger. Evelyn signed the preliminary papers anyway, her pen moving with practiced confidence, even as a small, persistent unease settled in her stomach, the kind of feeling she usually trusted but had learned to override in the name of progress. As the meeting adjourned and executives filed out into the rain-streaked evening, nobody noticed the black SUV idling across the street from the tower, its headlights off, its windows tinted dark enough to hide the three men waiting patiently inside. The vehicle pulled away from the curb the moment Evelyn's car left the parking structure, following at a careful, practiced distance, weaving through traffic with the unhurried patience of professionals who had done this kind of work many times before. Whoever they were not amateurs, looking for an easy robbery. Everything about their movements suggested planning, coordination, and a purpose far more deliberate than simple theft. And the storm rolling in over the skyline seemed to close around the city like a curtain being drawn before violence. The company gala had run late into the evening, all string quartets and champagne toasts to a merger that most of the room believed would make everyone richer. And Evelyn had finally excused herself sometime after 11, exhausted and eager to be alone with her thoughts. Her driver had already gone home sick earlier that day, and rather than wait 20 minutes for a replacement car service, she decided to walk the short distance down to the parking structure herself, phone in hand, heels echoing against the wet pavement of the entrance ramp. The overhead lights in the garage blinked twice, and then died completely as she reached the second level, plunging the concrete stairwell into a darkness broken only by the dim red glow of an emergency exit sign far down the corridor. She paused, telling herself it was simply an electrical fault, the kind of maintenance issue that happened in old buildings, and took 2 more steps forward before she heard the unmistakable sound of a boot scraping against concrete somewhere behind her. 3 men emerged from between the parked cars, their faces covered by dark fabric, moving with a coordination that made her stomach drop, long before she consciously understood what was happening. They did not shout demands for her purse or her jewelry, did not ask for a wallet or a car key, and their silence terrified her more than any threat could have, because it told her clearly that money was not what they had come for. One of them said her name, quietly, almost gently, as though confirming an appointment rather than announcing an ambush, and that single detail told Evelyn everything she needed to know about how carefully this had been planned. She turned and ran, her heels slipping against the slick concrete, weaving between parked vehicles as her pulse hammered somewhere in her throat, and she nearly made it to the stairwell before a hand closed around her wrist and yanked her backward with brutal efficiency. A blade flashed briefly under the dim emergency lighting, and pain bloomed hot and immediate across her upper arm as she twisted free, adrenaline overriding the shock enough to let her keep moving, blood already soaking through the sleeve of her blouse. She stumbled around the final corner and saw, impossibly, a single warm light glowing from an open utility closet, and inside it, a man in gray coveralls standing on a short ladder with a light bulb in his hand, utterly unaware of the chaos closing in behind her. She did not have breath left for a full sentence, did not have the strength for anything more than 2 desperate, half-whispered words that seemed to cost her the last of her remaining energy. Help me. And as Marcus Johnson slowly turned his head toward her, something in his expression changed so completely, so instantly, that for one strange heartbeat, she almost forgot she was bleeding at all. There was no hesitation in him, no confusion, no pause to ask what was happening, or why a bleeding stranger had just appeared in his doorway begging for rescue, because somewhere deep beneath the quiet maintenance worker, a different man had already taken control. Marcus's eyes moved across the corridor behind her in less than 2 seconds, cataloging 3 distinct shapes closing in from the stairwell side, noting the security camera mounted above the elevator bank that had almost certainly been disabled, and marking the blind spot created by a support pillar 15 feet to his left. Years of training that he had told himself belonged to a different lifetime surged back with terrifying clarity, muscle memory reasserting itself, the way a language never truly forgotten returns the instant it is spoken aloud again. He set the light bulb down without a sound, stepped off the ladder, and placed himself between Evelyn and the approaching footsteps, his posture shifting from relaxed to coiled, in a way that would have alarmed anyone who understood what they were looking at. He grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted on the nearby wall, not as a weapon exactly, but as a tool, the way he had once been taught to use whatever the environment offered, rather than whatever he happened to be carrying. With one motion, he yanked the pin and sprayed a thick white cloud across the corridor entrance, buying precious seconds of confusion, while he pulled Evelyn firmly but gently, by her uninjured arm, toward a service door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Inside lay the building's technical corridor, a narrow maze of pipes, electrical panels, and low-hanging conduits that Marcus had walked 1,000 times during 3 years of night shifts, and which he now understood, with cold clarity, might be the only thing standing between Evelyn Carter and whoever wanted her dead. He killed the corridor lights from a panel, just inside the door, plunging the narrow passage into near total darkness, and pulled Evelyn down low behind a bank of humming server equipment, his voice a near-silent whisper close to her ear. "Stay quiet, stay low, and trust me." One of the masked men pushed through the extinguisher fog moments later, sweeping a flashlight beam across the empty corridor, muttering into a small radio, clipped to his collar, that the target had slipped through a side door. Another voice on the radio, hard and low, ordered them to fan out and check every possible route, and it was in that exchange that something in the attacker's tone shifted from professional confidence to visible unease. From the shadows, watching through a gap between 2 server racks, Marcus observed how the men moved, their footwork, the way they held their weapons, the discipline in how they cleared corners, and a cold recognition settled into his chest that had nothing to do with fear. These were not street thugs hired for a quick job. Their movements carried the unmistakable fingerprints of formal tactical training, the kind taught in very specific places to very specific kinds of men. And then, from somewhere near the doorway, one of the masked figures froze mid-step, staring into the darkness where Marcus stood perfectly still, and whispered a single sentence that seemed to hang in the humming, electrical air far longer than it should have. "No way. It's him." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, though nothing on his face betrayed it, because recognition like that could only come from someone who had once stood on the same side of a very different kind of war. He filed the reaction away for later and focused entirely on the geometry of the corridor, on angles and distances, and the precise mathematics of violence that his body still understood, even when his conscious mind resisted remembering it. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the nearest attacker with a strike to the wrist that dropped a combat knife clattering onto the concrete, followed it with a controlled blow to the man's ribs that folded him instantly without a single unnecessary movement wasted. Evelyn, crouched behind the server rack with her hand still pressed to her bleeding shoulder, watched in stunned silence as the quiet maintenance man she had begged for help transformed into something closer to a machine, methodical, economical, and utterly without panic. The second attacker rushed forward, and Marcus used the narrow corridor itself as a weapon, angling his body so the man's momentum carried him directly into a low-hanging pipe, the impact enough to send him crumpling against the wall with a groan. The third man hesitated, radio crackling with urgent instructions Marcus could not quite make out, and in that hesitation, Marcus closed the distance and ended the confrontation with a precision that felt less like street fighting and more like a training exercise, executed flawlessly under real pressure. When it was over, less than 90 seconds after it had begun, three grown men lay incapacitated across the technical corridor, and Marcus Johnson stood breathing evenly in the dim emergency light, as though he had merely finished replacing another burnt-out bulb. Evelyn stared up at him from the floor, blood-soaked and trembling, and for the first time that night, she felt something other than terror settle over her, a fragile and unfamiliar sense that she might actually survive. What Evelyn did not know, and what Marcus had spent years trying very hard to forget, was that the man kneeling beside her to check her wound had once belonged to a classified special operations unit, so secretive that its very existence was denied by the government that had created it. His unit had specialized in hostage rescue operations in some of the most dangerous corners of the world, extracting kidnapped diplomats from mountain compounds, dismantling terrorist cells before they could strike, and providing close protection for heads of state whose names never appeared in any official record of who had kept them alive. Marcus had been good at his job, better than good, respected by commanding officers and quietly feared by the men who had once faced him across a battlefield, until a single mission years earlier had gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. He rarely allowed himself to think about that night, the extraction that had turned into an ambush, the friends who had not come home, and the official report that had quietly, deliberately buried the truth of what had actually happened inside layers of classification, so thick that even he had eventually stopped trying to uncover it. He had walked away from that world afterward, resigned his position, scrubbed his own name from every database he could access, and rebuilt himself from nothing into the quiet, unremarkable maintenance worker that his coworkers thought they knew. Now, kneeling in a darkened service corridor beside a bleeding stranger who happened to run one of the largest technology companies in the country, that carefully buried past had resurfaced in the space of a single terrifying evening. Marcus pressed a clean cloth from his toolkit firmly against Evelyn's wound, his hand steady despite everything, and helped her to her feet, guiding her deeper into the maze of service corridors that only someone who had worked in that building for years could possibly navigate in the dark. Evelyn, still in shock but sharp enough to notice everything, finally found her voice as they moved. "Who are you?" she asked, and Marcus, focused entirely on the path ahead, offered her nothing but silence, because some questions, he had learned long ago, were far more dangerous to answer than to leave hanging in the dark. They emerged eventually through a maintenance hatch near the loading dock, several blocks from where the SUV had first begun following her earlier that evening, and Marcus insisted on walking her personally to a small 24-hour diner rather than risking a taxi or ride service that could potentially be tracked. Over black coffee neither of them drank, Evelyn studied him carefully, noting the calm efficiency with which he had bandaged her wound, using supplies from a small kit he apparently carried in his truck at all times, the kind of preparation that belonged to someone who expected violence, rather than someone who merely tolerated it. She pressed him gently for answers about who he really was, about where a maintenance man had learned to disarm 3 trained attackers without breaking a sweat. And each time, Marcus deflected with quiet, polite non-answers that told her almost nothing, while somehow also telling her everything she needed to know. It became clear to her, sitting across that scratched diner table in her torn and bloodied blouse, that whoever this man had once been, it was not something he wanted, or perhaps was even allowed, to discuss. Evelyn spent that first night in a state somewhere between shock and disbelief, replaying the sequence of events over and over in her mind, as she sat wrapped in a spare jacket Marcus had produced from the back of his truck, watching him check the locks on the motel room door for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. She had built her entire career on the assumption that she could read people accurately within minutes of meeting them, a skill that had served her well through countless negotiations and hostile boardroom confrontations, yet she found herself completely unable to categorize the man sitting across from her. He was too calm to be an ordinary bystander who had simply gotten lucky, too skilled to be anything other than deliberately, extensively trained, and too reluctant to explain any of it for her to believe he was simply modest about a talent he happened to possess. When she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep sometime near dawn, Marcus remained awake in the chair by the door, eyes half closed but alert, listening to every sound in the corridor outside with the patient vigilance of a man who had spent years learning that rest and safety were rarely available at the same time. Marcus began investigating quietly the following day, using contacts he had not spoken to in years, careful phone calls placed from a burner device he kept for emergencies he had hoped he would never need again. What he uncovered troubled him deeply, because the attack had none of the hallmarks of a simple robbery or even a targeted kidnapping for ransom. Everything about the operation suggested a far more calculated objective, one designed not to harm Evelyn permanently, but to remove her from the equation just long enough to force a change in control at Carter Dynamics. A merger worth billions of dollars was set to finalize within the week, and if Evelyn Carter were to disappear or die before the paperwork closed, control of the company would shift automatically to a smaller group of shareholders, several of whom, Marcus discovered, had recently received substantial and carefully hidden payments from an overseas investment fund with a history of aggressive corporate takeovers. Richard Voss, the silver-haired board member who had objected so loudly to the merger in that glass boardroom, turned out to be at the very center of the arrangement. His public opposition to the deal, a carefully constructed piece of theater designed to disguise his true involvement. When Marcus laid out what he had found, sitting across from Evelyn in the modest safety of a rented motel room on the edge of the city, she went pale, recognizing immediately the names and numbers he described from documents she herself had signed without fully understanding their implications. It became clear to both of them that survival was no longer a matter of simply waiting for the police to sort things out, because whoever controlled that foreign investment fund had resources, patience, and reach that extended into places neither of them could easily identify or trust. Marcus and Evelyn, a former operative trying desperately to stay hidden and a CEO used to controlling every variable in her life, found themselves forced into an uneasy but necessary partnership, each one needing something only the other could provide. For the first time since that night in the parking garage, Evelyn allowed herself to really look at the man protecting her, past the uniform, past the silence, and she began to see something she had not expected to find. Not a weapon, but a deeply careful, deeply decent man who seemed almost embarrassed by his own violent competence. That fragile trust deepened over the following 2 days as they moved carefully through the city, avoiding hotels, credit cards, and anything that could be traced, sleeping in shifts in a series of anonymous rooms, while Marcus continued quietly gathering evidence against Voss and his overseas partners. Then, late on the second night, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, 4 words that turned his blood cold in a way that 3 armed attackers in a parking garage never had. "We know you're alive." It meant that whoever was behind this operation had not simply hired random mercenaries. They had somehow connected the maintenance worker who had disrupted their plans to a name and a history that was supposed to have vanished from every official record years ago, and that meant the danger to both Marcus and Evelyn had just grown considerably more personal and considerably more dangerous. Over the following days, the pursuit intensified dramatically, with Voss's people deploying more men and greater resources, no longer content to treat the situation as a simple extraction gone wrong. Marcus responded by drawing on every piece of tactical knowledge he had spent years trying to forget, constantly varying their routes through the city, never staying in one location longer than a few hours, and using the kind of urban terrain that most people walked past every day without ever considering its strategic value. They moved through crowded subway platforms during rush hour, disappearing into the press of bodies before emerging 3 stops later on a different line entirely, and once slipped through a maintenance tunnel beneath a downtown transit hub that Marcus knew from an old job years before Evelyn had ever heard of Carter Dynamics. When streets became too dangerous, he led her across connected rooftops between older buildings downtown, moving with a confidence that suggested he had done this exact kind of evasion many times before, in places far more hostile than this rain-slicked American city. During one especially tense stretch near midday, they were forced to abandon an entire planned route after Marcus spotted a parked sedan holding two men who matched the build and posture of the attackers from the parking garage, sitting motionless outside a coffee shop where they had intended to rest for an hour. Rather than panic, Marcus calmly steered Evelyn in the opposite direction, walking at an unhurried pace through a farmer's market crowded with vendors and shoppers, using the press of bodies and the chaos of stalls selling produce and flowers to break any possible line of sight. He explained quietly, without being asked, that predictable patterns were the single greatest vulnerability a person on the run could have, and that survival depended less on speed than on the discipline to never do the expected thing twice in a row. Evelyn absorbed every word carefully, and somewhere in the middle of that crowded market, surrounded by strangers who had no idea two lives hung in the balance beside them, she realized she had stopped being merely a passenger in her own survival and had started, in small but real ways, to think the way Marcus thought. What struck Evelyn most, watching him work, was how deliberately restrained his violence remained, even under enormous pressure, how he consistently chose the path that avoided unnecessary harm, even when a more direct and brutal solution might have been faster or easier. During a brief moment of rest inside an abandoned laundromat on the edge of downtown, Marcus knelt beside her and carefully redressed the wound on her shoulder, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked, his focus total, despite the exhaustion visible in the tightness around his eyes. Evelyn found herself studying his face in that quiet moment, no longer seeing only the danger he represented, but noticing instead the tired kindness underneath it, the weight of something he carried that had nothing to do with the current crisis and everything to do with whatever had happened to him long before they had ever met. She reached out without quite deciding to, and rested her hand briefly over his, and for a single suspended moment, neither of them moved, the growing distance between stranger and something more collapsing quietly in the dim, dusty light of that abandoned building. It was during this fragile lull that Marcus discovered something far more disturbing than he had anticipated. Intercepting a coded transmission on a police scanner frequency he had modified years earlier for exactly this kind of contingency. Someone inside the city's police department, someone with access to sensitive operational details, had been feeding information about Marcus and Evelyn's movements directly to Voss's people, which explained how their carefully planned evasive routes had nearly been intercepted twice in the past 12 hours, despite Marcus's meticulous precautions. The realization meant they could no longer trust the very institution that should have been protecting them, and it forced Marcus into a decision he had hoped never to make again. Rather than continuing to run indefinitely from an enemy with unlimited resources, and now a source inside law enforcement itself, he would need to stop running entirely and force a confrontation on ground of his own choosing. Marcus chose the Carter Dynamics Tower itself as the site for that confrontation, a decision that struck Evelyn initially as reckless until he explained his reasoning with the same calm precision he brought to every other aspect of his former profession. The building was massive, familiar to him after 3 years of nightly maintenance work, and filled with systems he understood intimately, from the electrical grid to the elevator controls to the network of service corridors that ran like hidden veins beneath the polished corporate surface visitors saw every day. If their pursuers wanted to finish what they had started, Marcus intended to make sure they did it on terrain that offered him every possible advantage, transforming a symbol of Evelyn's success into something closer to a carefully constructed trap. Over the following hours, working with quiet, methodical focus, he disabled specific security cameras while leaving others active, rerouted portions of the building's electrical system to allow him to kill power to entire floors on command, and locked several elevator banks into positions that would funnel any pursuers into narrow, predictable corridors. Evelyn watched this transformation with something approaching awe, seeing for the first time the full scope of what Marcus was truly capable of, not simply as a fighter, but as a strategist who thought several steps ahead of everyone around him. She noticed, too, how carefully he avoided any plan that might result in unnecessary death, favoring incapacitation, disorientation, and controlled chaos over anything more permanent, a philosophy that seemed to run counter to everything she had assumed about men trained for violence. When she asked him directly why he refused to simply eliminate the threat, entirely given the resources apparently arrayed against them, Marcus paused for a long moment before answering quietly that he had already lost too many parts of himself to violence, and he refused to lose whatever remained just to make this fight easier. It was in that honest, unguarded admission that Evelyn understood completely why this particular man, of all the people who might have been standing in that parking garage that rainy night, was the one who had answered when she whispered for help. The enemy arrived at the tower just after midnight, moving in coordinated teams through entrances Marcus had deliberately left accessible, walking directly into a building that had been quietly reshaped into something closer to a chessboard than a corporate headquarters. As the first group reached the fourth floor, Marcus killed the lights across that entire level, throwing the space into total darkness, broken only by emergency lighting strips he had rewired to flash at irregular intervals, disorienting anyone unfamiliar with the layout. He picked them off one team at a time, using narrow corridors and locked stairwells to isolate small groups from the larger force, applying exactly enough force to incapacitate without escalating beyond what the situation absolutely required. Evelyn, positioned safely in a reinforced records room with a direct line to a journalist and an FBI contact Marcus had insisted she reach out to earlier that day, transmitted digital copies of Voss's financial documents, even as the confrontation unfolded several floors below her. It was on the 15th floor, in a corridor lined with darkened offices, that Marcus finally came face to face with the man leading the assault, and the moment their eyes met, recognition passed between them, like an electric current. The man removed his mask slowly, revealing features Marcus had not seen in almost 6 years, and spoke a name that had not been used to address Marcus since the night everything had gone wrong on that final overseas mission. Colonel Nathaniel Briggs, once Marcus's commanding officer, once a man he had trusted with his life, more completely than almost anyone else on Earth, stood now on the opposite side of a fight that suddenly felt far larger and far older than a corporate takeover scheme. Marcus's expression did not change, but something inside him hardened into a stillness that felt almost like grief, because the man in front of him represented not just a present danger, but the unresolved wound of everything Marcus had spent years trying to bury. Briggs spoke first, his voice carrying the same calm authority Marcus remembered from years of taking orders from him, explaining with almost clinical detachment that the mission which had ended Marcus's career, the one officially recorded as a tragic failure, had actually been deliberately sabotaged from within their own command structure. Marcus had not failed that night. He had been set up, positioned as an expendable piece in an operation designed to fail, specifically so that certain classified assets could be quietly transferred elsewhere, and the men who had died alongside him had been sacrificed to protect people far above both their pay grades. The revelation hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have. Years of quiet guilt and unresolved grief suddenly reframed into something closer to rage. And for a moment, the discipline that had carried him through everything since that night wavered dangerously close to breaking. Evelyn had always believed her father, Harold Carter, built the foundation of the company through nothing but relentless work and honest ambition, a story she had repeated proudly in countless interviews and shareholder meetings over the years, without ever questioning its accuracy. He had died when she was only 26, leaving her the controlling shares of a mid-sized software firm that she had since grown, through her own considerable talent, into a global technology giant. And she had always assumed the earliest chapters of that story were as clean as the ones she had personally written. Sitting alone in the records room that night, scrolling through digitized archives she had never before had reason to examine so closely, she felt something close to grief settle over her, not for the danger she now faced, but for the quiet realization that the man she had idolized had once made a choice, however unknowing, that had planted a seed of corruption inside the company she loved. In the records room above, Evelyn made a discovery of her own that connected these two seemingly separate stories, in a way neither she nor Marcus had anticipated. Finding buried within her late father's old business archives a decades-old contract, fund now trying to seize control of her business. Her father, long dead, and remembered by Evelyn as an honorable, if occasionally naive, businessman, had unknowingly signed an agreement decades earlier that had planted the seeds of everything now threatening her life and her company. The realization left her shaken, understanding suddenly that the danger surrounding her was not simply the product of recent corporate greed, but the culmination of choices made long before she had ever taken control of the company her father had built. Standing in that darkened 15th floor corridor, facing the man who had once been his commanding officer and mentor, Marcus was offered a choice framed by Briggs as an opportunity for justice. Join him, use the skills Marcus had spent years suppressing, and together dismantle the corrupt network that had used them both, whatever the cost to everyone standing in their way, including Evelyn. Marcus considered it for a long, silent moment, the temptation of revenge, for a betrayal that had cost him everything, pulling at something deep and old inside him, a wound that had never fully healed, no matter how quietly he had tried to bury it, beneath a life of anonymous maintenance work. But then, unbidden, he thought of Evelyn's hand resting over his in that abandoned laundromat, of her trust in him despite everything, of the fragile decency that had survived in him, precisely because he had refused, again and again, to let violence become the whole of who he was. He told Briggs no. Whatever justice looked like, it would not come at the cost of another innocent life, and it would not come from the same broken system that had already taken so much from both of them. Briggs's expression darkened at the refusal, and he gave a quiet, resigned order into his radio, one that Marcus recognized instantly as the activation signal for whatever final contingency plan had been prepared in case negotiation failed. Alarms began sounding throughout the building's upper floors as a secondary team, previously held in reserve, moved swiftly toward the records room where Evelyn remained, and Marcus understood immediately that the true danger of this entire confrontation had only just begun. The final confrontation unfolded on the tower's exposed rooftop terrace, rain hammering down in cold sheets, while wind howled between the surrounding skyscrapers, and Marcus arrived just in time to intercept the reserve team before they could reach Evelyn, forcing the fight into the open, where the storm itself became almost another opponent to contend with. He moved through the confrontation with a controlled, exhausted determination. Every technique honed by years of training, executed not with flashy theatrics, but with the grim efficiency of a man who had long ago accepted that survival rarely looked heroic up close. Lightning flickered somewhere over the harbor, as Marcus disarmed one attacker after another, taking hits himself that would have staggered most men, absorbing pain with the same disciplined calm he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, refusing to let exhaustion translate into carelessness. Briggs emerged last, stepping onto the rooftop with the calm confidence of a man who still believed, even now, that he held every advantage, and the fight between former commander and former soldier that followed carried none of the choreography of a spectacle, only the brutal, economical desperation of two men who each understood exactly how to end a human life quickly if given the chance. Marcus fought not for vengeance, but for survival, for Evelyn's safety, for the quiet future he had built for himself, and now refused to let anyone take away. And slowly, through sheer discipline rather than superior strength, he gained the advantage, eventually pinning Briggs against the rooftop railing, with the rain streaming down both their faces. He did not kill him. Instead, restraining Briggs with a control that clearly cost him every remaining reserve of strength. Marcus held the position until security teams, alerted by the FBI contact Evelyn, had reached hours earlier, finally surged onto the rooftop and took the former colonel into custody. The documents Evelyn had transmitted throughout the night, combined with Briggs's own recorded confession from the 15th floor corridor, provided more than enough evidence to unravel the entire conspiracy, exposing Richard Voss, the overseas investment fund, and the corrupted elements within both the corporate world and law enforcement that had enabled the entire scheme. When it was finally over, Evelyn crossed the rain-soaked rooftop and wrapped her arms around Marcus without hesitation, without calculation, without any of the careful control that defined her every public moment. And for the first time since that night in the parking garage, perhaps for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to cry openly against the shoulder of a man she had known for barely a week, but somehow trusted more completely than almost anyone else in her life. Marcus held her carefully, exhaustion and relief washing through him in equal measure. And above them, the storm finally began to break, thin streaks of dawn light, bleeding slowly through the clearing clouds. Several months passed before the city's attention fully moved on from the scandal that had briefly dominated every business headline, the story of a corporate conspiracy involving a foreign investment fund, a corrupted board member, and an attempted assassination that had somehow been thwarted by forces nobody in the media ever fully identified. Richard Voss faced federal charges that would keep him occupied with lawyers for years to come, and Colonel Nathaniel Briggs disappeared into a legal process shrouded in enough classification that even those following the case closely understood they would likely never learn its full outcome. Marcus Johnson quietly returned to his ordinary life, resuming his position on the building's maintenance crew as though nothing extraordinary had happened, declining every opportunity that came his way to speak publicly about the events of that rainy autumn week, refusing interviews, refusing recognition, refusing anything that might pull him back into the kind of visibility he had spent years deliberately avoiding. A federal agent named Diane Farrow, who had led the investigation into Voss and the broader conspiracy, personally visited Marcus at his apartment one afternoon to offer him a formal commendation on behalf of an agency that technically still could not acknowledge most of what had actually happened that week. Marcus thanked her politely, declined the paperwork with the same quiet firmness he brought to everything else in his life, and asked only that his name be left out of whatever official summary eventually made its way into a classified file somewhere. Farrow, who had reviewed enough of his old service record to understand at least a fragment of who she was truly speaking with, respected the request without argument, recognizing in him the particular kind of quiet integrity that rarely asked for anything in return for extraordinary sacrifice. He wanted no medals, no headlines, no acknowledgement beyond the simple satisfaction of knowing that he had done what needed to be done, and that satisfaction, quiet and private, was enough for him in a way that public recognition never could have been. Evelyn, meanwhile, used the months following the crisis to quietly and thoroughly reform Carter Dynamics from the inside, removing every board member connected to the scandal, restructuring the company's governance to prevent similar vulnerabilities in the future, and rebuilding the trust of shareholders and employees who had watched their company nearly collapse under the weight of hidden corruption. She never spoke publicly about Marcus's role in her survival either, protecting his privacy as fiercely as he protected it himself, understanding instinctively that his peace mattered more to her than any credit she might have claimed for uncovering the truth. One quiet afternoon, weeks after the last of the legal proceedings had finally concluded, Evelyn found herself standing outside the small maintenance office on the building's ground floor, hesitating for a long moment before finally pushing open the door. Inside, Marcus knelt beside an old air conditioning unit, sleeves rolled up, focused entirely on the task in front of him, looking for all the world exactly like the quiet, unremarkable man his coworkers had always believed him to be. He glanced up when he heard the door, and something in his expression softened immediately at the sight of her, a warmth that had grown slowly and carefully between them over the difficult weeks they had shared. Evelyn smiled, crossing the small room with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through every boardroom battle of her career, though something in her posture now seemed lighter, less armored, than it had before that rainy night had changed everything. "Last time," she said softly, "I only managed to say help me." Marcus set down his tools slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth as he studied her face, a faint smile beginning to form at the corner of his mouth for perhaps the first time she had ever seen so completely unguarded. "And this time?" he asked, his voice low and steady, carrying none of the careful distance he had once kept between himself and everyone around him. Evelyn stepped closer, close enough that the space between them felt charged with everything neither of them had yet found the words to say, and when she finally spoke, Her voice carried none of the desperation of that terrible night in the parking garage, only quiet, deliberate certainty. "This time," she said, "I want you to stay." Marcus stood completely still for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that had nothing to do with tactical calculation and everything to do with a peace he had not allowed himself to feel in longer than he could remember. There were no gunshots that afternoon, no shadows following them through darkened corridors, no whispered warnings crackling across hidden radio frequencies, only the ordinary hum of the air conditioning unit and the soft afternoon light spilling through the small office window. Two people who had walked together through violence and betrayal and the slow unraveling of secrets neither of them had asked to inherit now stood quietly in an unremarkable maintenance room, having found something neither of them had expected to find on that rainy night when everything began. Later that afternoon, they left the building together, walking out into streets washed clean by weeks of distant rain, sunlight finally breaking warm and steady across the city skyline behind them. Marcus Johnson, a man who had spent years trying to bury a past he believed could only bring danger to everyone around him, walked beside Evelyn Carter, not as a bodyguard, not as a stranger who had once answered a desperate whisper for help, but simply as himself, fully and finally, for the first time in longer than either of them could measure.